Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're listening to this session or watching this session. Welcome to our monthly Cyber Threat Intelligence webinar. I'm your usual host, Matt Hull. I look after threat intelligence and incident response and other services at NCC Group, and I've been hosting these for a good while. So in terms of what we're going to look at today, I'm going to start by having a quick overview of what's going on in the criminal ecosystem in the world of cybercrime. That's going to also include some of our ransomware trends, going to give you a sneak peek of what the wrap up for 2025 looked like in terms of the ransomware numbers. Then just going to look through a number of items that I've picked up on over the last few weeks that you may or may not have seen, but just a couple of items that I think are particularly relevant given the overall trend of things at the moment. And then last but not least, wanted to cover off some strategic considerations for 2026. So I know in the session that we had in January, I put on a Mystic Meg outfit and got the crystal ball out and tried to look into the future and provide some advice on what you folks can be doing as we go into 2026. But I've just put that into a little bit more detail for people in my usual style, the what and then the now what. So hopefully giving you some context, but also things that you can actually be cracking on with as we get into the new year. Saying that it's near the end of February already, so I don't know where the new year's going. So let's get kicking off with criminal ecosystem. So one of the things that we picked up on during the course of our research over the last year was that ransomware-as-a-service brands, so to speak, so the different variants and operators that were out there, rose to a whopping 127 different brands by the end of 2025. Prior years were much, much lower numbers than that. So what that has demonstrated is that the RAS model is still alive and kicking. A number of groups disbanded, rebranded, and expanded in some cases as well. But also we saw affiliates, so the users of these groups and also the access brokers that provide ransomware actors with their leak sites, with the credentials, with initial access to organizations. There was an awful lot of movement in that space as well through the research that we conducted in the various dark web forums and marketplaces. So what that means for us as defenders is there's an awful lot for us to keep an eye on. So what is the noise and what's the reality of things? What we recommend, or certainly what I recommend in terms of the ransomware landscape, is be aware that these changes are taking place, but try and focus and zoom in on those top TTPs that are associated with these ransomware groups. IOC is also really, really relevant and useful, but run out of life very, very quickly. So keep abreast of the behavioral aspects of what's going on when it comes to ransomware operators. Furthermore, just to make our lives a little bit difficult, I touched on it a few times during the course of last year, but the extortion-only model, i.e. the exfiltrate data and use that as leverage for extortion, that well and truly proved itself to be a reality by the end of 2025. We've got a good write-up on what that means and looks like in the annual report, so look out for that. A couple of other interesting tidbits for folks. So we saw during the course of our review of last year, when the analysts were doing their work around the ransomware numbers, were lots of fabricated claims by various ransomware operators. So when you look at our numbers for the final tally for the whole year, you'll see some slight variances between what we reported in month versus what we've reported at the end of the year, and that's because we've implemented a mechanism by which to identify fabricated victim listings, where there's been in some cases duplicate listings as well. And if you didn't see it in our January review, there was a write-up on how we've changed our approaches here at NCC Group and within the threat intel team here in terms of tracking those ransomware activities and how we can get some validity behind those numbers. And then the last sort of interesting thing, just from a law enforcement intervention point of view, we continue to see takedowns across the criminal ecosystem, but a story that particularly pricked my ears, because you know me, I quite like something a bit amusing. A developer for the ID malware as a service operation faked their own death recently to try and evade capture by law enforcement operatives. I've put here, it highlights operational sophistication. I think it highlights just general stupidity, dare I say, in terms of the criminal space. So interesting goings on in terms of criminality. What that means for ransomware, though, here we go. Sneak peek 2024 to 2025, we saw an increase of 50% of ransomware victims based on our tracking model, which is focused on looking at various leak sites. So big spike at the early part of 2025. We know that was around the CLOP activity. There was a secondary CLOP activity around April and May, but doing some validation of that, there were a number of fabricated incidents, but also duplicate instances as well. But that hasn't fundamentally changed the overall picture, that there were significantly more incidents in 2025 than there were in the prior year. So that's 3 years on the bounce now, where we've seen an increase in the number of victims to these types of activity. In terms of the variants that were top of the list, Killin, Akira, and Clop, names that frequently appear during the course of the year. Smaller number of victims, so smaller volume of victims, but bigger impact, don't appear on that list. So obviously your Scattered Spider group, which had fun and games during the course of the summer, don't necessarily appear in the top 10, but had massive impact across the ecosystem. And in terms of targeted sectors, no real surprise, we saw industrials and consumer discretionary regularly at the top of the list in terms of victimology during the year, and then smaller impact across IT, healthcare, and other consumer markets as well. So nothing out of the ordinary there, other than the fact that 2025 was yet another massive year when it comes to the number of ransomware incidents and victims. So there's a bit more detail coming up in the annual report on that, but what's going on in terms of general threats? So I've called out a couple of supply chain incidents. So ransomware operator called Warlock, don't appear in that top 10, but a smaller group, had some fairly decent success recently targeting applications run by Smarter Tools, and in particular their Smarter Email application. So they were able to compromise Smarter Tools' internal network. There was a single VM that was unpatched running the SmarterMail email server. And the CV that I put in there at the bottom was the vulnerability that was impacted, but a single VM, and the threat actor, the Warlock group, were able to laterally move out of that VM across the estate. Smart Tools have indicated that no customer data was in fact impacted. That's what they've said, but we'll keep an eye on that one just in case anything's come out of that. Another supply chain incident. This is a little bit deeper. So this is for folks who might leverage Android tablets and handhelds within their estates in any way, shape or form. So an interesting firmware supply chain breach, which has resulted in a backdoor called Kinadu, if I'm pronouncing that right, being deployed onto various Android tablets. This is a piece of research that was initially conducted by Kaspersky, but has been picked up by a couple of other reports. But the Kinadu malware within the firmware basically sits dormant for a small period of time before then activating. And it's been mostly used, so according to the research, for ad fraud, sort of browser hijacking, installing unwanted apps, potential crypto type gathering. So it appears financially motivated at this point, but wouldn't rule out that this is potentially linked to something a little bit bigger. It's unusual for a financially motivated group to go to that firmware level. But anyway, there's some really good write-ups around this, possibly worth having a look at if you do leverage tablets within your estate. The Kaspersky reports only mention 2 or 3 manufacturers and parts of the supply chain in their report, but definitely worth looking at some of the TTPs and other indicators that came out of the reporting for this if you do leverage these things in your estate. So on the AI piece, there is a Russian-speaking, or at least someone that's been identified as potentially Russian-speaking threat actor, appears to be financially motivated, has been able to take advantage of generative AI. So I've talked about this many times, AI, and particularly LLMs, being that new enabler for criminality, and this is kind of proof of the pudding, or proof in the pudding. So leveraging Gen AI off the shelf doesn't specifically say in the reporting that I've seen around this which versions, whether it's OpenAI or other, but we're able to speed up their criminal activities. So identifying exposed infrastructure, conducting vulnerability scans, harvesting weak and exposed credentials, being able to do that at scale and at speed, which resulted in 600 Fortigate firewalls being compromised across the globe in a relatively short 5-week campaign. And this is an individual being able to do this. So I wanted to call this out as, I guess, a little bit of a reference to some of the stuff that I've been talking about over the last year or so when I get questioned about AI. It is an enabler. It is reducing the barrier to entry for criminality. And it has the increased use of and availability of AI tooling in hacks and compromises made it more difficult to attribute attacks to individuals and threat actor groups. In short, yes, there's a lot of activity that's going on in terms of obfuscation, so loads of new techniques that are available. But one of the big things around attribution, for example, in phishing campaigns, it was fairly easy to see where the phishing campaign was coming from based on the language that was used within those emails, for example. That is obviously a lot harder when you're able to write an email or spin up a fake website using LLMs or generative AI. And I guess to the point on this incident that I've mentioned here about Fortigate, a lot of that scanning, a lot of that credential gathering will just appear as Python scripts, I guess, behind the scenes. I'm not sure how those models do it. But yes, in short, it is making our life a lot harder when it comes to attribution. That's been an ongoing trend in general anyway, in terms of cyber defense. Last on the threat roundup is, I guess, a continuation of China's continued interest in critical national infrastructure, particularly around telcos. So I know there's a few folks that regularly join these calls from that sort of space. This has been a move towards Singapore in this case, and reporting has indicated that 4 of the major telcos in Singapore, namely Singtel, StarHub, M1 and Simba Telecom, have been compromised by Chinese-linked actors. It would appear from reports that have come out that there's been very little impact or very little disruption or loss of personal data or theft of personal data. But this harks back to the activity that I've mentioned on a few occasions with China pre-positioning within critical national infrastructure for further incidents. Similar to what we saw in North America and the targeting of those, this is perhaps what we're seeing here with Singapore is a couple of months prior to what would have eventually become some fairly significant operational disruption within that space. And I think it's fair to say, and I just wanted to remind folks really around the cyber capabilities linked to nation state actors. There's an awful lot going on in the world of geopolitics when it comes to diplomatic relations, what we're seeing between North America and Europe and the relations there, various economic pressures. So we saw this week that the Trump administration has been forced to roll back on their tariffs, and also the military positioning around the globe. So continuation of activity in South China Sea, what's going on around Iran as well in particular. All of these things have a potential influence on what we see from a nation state capability point of view. And what we're seeing with China in particular is this is part of the 5-year economic plan, looking for intellectual property and harnessing intelligence around individuals that are potentially relevant to the state. Diplomatic signaling, John, essentially the messages that are coming from Donald Trump, the messages that are coming out of Europe around what they plan on doing with future activity, essentially. So just diplomatic comms, I guess, is the best way I can describe that. I just wanted to put a little food for thought into this one. So a lot of organizations, when I'm speaking to them, they're less maybe interested on the geopol side of things to actually matter, but there's a few things that I sort of push back on when it comes to this, and I know there's quite a lot of technical folks in the call, so apologize if this is a little bit too strategic, but some questions probably to ask if you're wondering what's the point in understanding geopolitical situations and the strategic threat landscape. For example, here looking at the telco, does your organization rely on national telco infrastructure? And what would the impact be if, for example, there was a physical hardwire cut on an internet service provider, or if one of these organizations that were mentioned here in Singapore, for example, were the subject of sabotage from a nation state? What impact would that have on your organization? From a risk point of view, likelihood is probably very low, but impact is probably very high in that sense. And if that is the case, have you considered scenarios around these things? Have you conducted tabletop exercises, sort of compromise assessments, and those goal team engagements? And is your resilience plan built to sustain this type of impact if it were to go wrong? And last but not least, I guess, if those questions are sort of ringing true and they're making you ask even more questions internally, is it worth monitoring geopolitical developments as cyber risk drivers and leading that into your risk planning? So that's for the more strategic people, maybe risk managers on the call, and just a little bit of food for thought around the geopolitical landscape and how that influences cyber operations and your business continuity. Last but not least, on the threat roundup today, lots of ongoing activity in the Netherlands at the minute. Another telco by sheer coincidence, but I wanted to call it out. One of our old friends, ShinyHunters, which is a ransomware operator. I've got a bit of a threat profile coming up, so I won't talk too much about them. But they've compromised Adido's systems. So Adido is a Dutch telco. They've recently threatened to publish details of customers. Some of the customers within the data set appears to be very old indeed, even non-existing customers, which begs some other questions around GDPR and such like. Big breach there. I'm aware that a number of customers are being told that they are part of this breach data set. I'm calling out really because of ShinyHunters. So ShinyHunters are a financially motivated threat group. They appeared around 2020. So we reported on them in limited detail a number of years ago. There was very little known about the group early on. I've just put another little tidbit, a little fun fact for everyone. So the group's actually named after a Pokemon character or a Pokemon process looking for shiny characters. So 2024 is probably when ShinyHunters came out into the public domain. The Ticketmaster breach, which some of you may or may not remember, as a result of a compromised Snowflake account. It wasn't just Ticketmaster, there were a couple of other organizations that were impacted by that. And then over the course of 2025, a number of other incidents involving ShinyHunters. There was a Salesforce campaign targeting OAuth tokens, and it was essentially a supply chain attack, in fact, impacting about 200 organizations through Salesforce. That was originally tracked as UNC 6040, but it's been since associated with ShinyHunters. The group formed a weird pseudo extortion collective known as Scattered Lapsus Hunters. So this was around the summer time, just after the retail threat incidents that we saw here in the UK and into North America. So Scattered Spider, Lapsus, and ShinyHunters came together to support one another's activities. They also demonstrated a move away from data exfil only and extortion, and started focusing on Ransomware-as-a-Service, or RAS. The platform that they spun up was called Shiny Spider, with a few letters in there just for a bit of elite speak. So that's the group in general. As I said, I'm calling these guys out because we've done some threat hunting on them within our activities just before Christmas. In fact, a bit of useful information came off the back of that. We'll be looking to publish a threat profile and some briefing documents for folks if you want to do some hunting yourselves around this particular group. And as I say, at the end of the slide deck today, I've added some TTPs that we've got associated with ShinyHunters in case anyone would like to have a look at those. I'm sorry, it's going to be in a PDF. It's not easy to extract for folks, but there's some detail in there anyway. Last thing from me today, before I take any other questions, please do keep them coming in if there's anything that's going on out there. So strategic thoughts for 2026, what's going on? So I've touched on it already: automation, reducing that attacker cost and increasing speed, lowering the entry barrier to criminality, and particularly talking about the leveraging of AI models there. Foundational weaknesses, so issues with identity, weak passwords, exposures, misconfigurations. These things are now being exploited at scale. Very little activity in the sophisticated zero-day type work, but cyber criminals relying specifically on opportunities around basic fundamental cybersecurity flaws. And this isn't just cyber criminals, this is nation state and APT level groups as well. CNI compromises will continue, in some cases stay latent, and what I mean by that is that pre-positioning, so sitting dormant within environments, but potentially escalating to sabotage, exfiltration, and other activity in light of potential geopolitical escalations. I mentioned this in January, but I do want to call it out again. We continue to see organizations being compromised through their supply chain, and whether that be up chain or down chain, it doesn't really matter. So the assumptions that we've seen in some of our reporting is that our supply chain is secure, or we know who our supply chain is in some cases, aren't necessarily accurate. So certainly something that, well, I'm going to make a recommendation on in a moment anyway. And then the last one, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, this, because I'm talking about threat intel here. So threat intelligence reporting and the reporting of vulnerability intelligence and all of that, volume is coming at you all thick and fast. And I'm acutely aware that I'm one of those people coming at you thick and fast with threat reporting, which is why I try and keep an eye on doing it quality over quantity, and actually tell you now what when it comes to these things as well. So just bear that in mind. Hopefully I'm not going to see numbers drop off by calling out the fact that threat intelligence is coming at you thick and fast, but just wanted to bear that in mind. And if you are leveraging threat intelligence within your environments, or you are indeed threat intelligence folks, then really try and make sure that you answer that so what, now what question. Why is this relevant to me, and what am I going to do about it now? Make it actionable. So with that in mind, here's my now what to those strategic considerations. Focus on MFA, focus on identifying your external estate, understanding what your external estate is and what your assets look like, whether that be using an ASM type capability or a digital risk monitoring or something akin to that. Make sure you know what you're defending and what you're monitoring that's internet facing. And focus on those identity type issues, such as stolen credentials, what service accounts you've got out there. Have you accidentally ended up with hard-coded credentials in a GitHub repo or something like that? Monitoring that external threat. Third-party risk as an operational risk, absolutely, and I will talk about this unapologetically during the rest of the year. Ensure that you understand who your supply chain is. How many layers you go is up for debate, but having a really good understanding of what the onboarding and offboarding processes are, and also monitoring that supply chain if possible as well. If you operate in the CNI space, assume that you have been popped. Essentially, assume that there is some sort of pre-positioning taking place or some access that's going on. It might not be the case, but it's worth preparing for it. And based on that, conduct cyber resilience exercises, leverage threat hunting where possible. If you're able to, look at specific detection logic for these nation state type threats, and practice, essentially. So if you do end up in that situation, like unfortunately we've seen in the telco arena across the globe, at least you're well prepared for those incidents coming down the pipe. I mentioned before IOCs really useful, but they drop off in terms of their validity quite quickly. Their time to live is limited. So if you do have a detection capability in-house, if you are a threat intelligence function in-house, really do try and pivot towards that behavior based detection logic where possible. You will get a lot more out of it. We've seen that from what we're doing around our hypothesis driven threat hunting in NCC. It's less about tracking IOCs, it's about finding the gaps using those behavioral type detections. And then last but not least, on the now what, focus on high quality intelligence outputs. You need to know what to do with the things that you're being told. if it doesn't inform a decision, intelligence is not really helping. Hopefully, you're getting those things from myself when I do these briefings and the other reports that NCC is pumping out. They're my sort of strategic considerations for 2026 and the now what's. Kristen, could you give a bit more detail on examples about geopolitics as an increasingly important driver of cyber risk, perhaps noting any changes over time, key actors, specific technologies, tooling, and thank you as well, Kristen, for that. So yes, just some examples. I don't want to over egg the wars situation that's taken place, but if we look at Ukraine, a lot of what's come out of Ukraine when it comes to cyber activity has been around disruption. It's been around destruction and the malware leveraged by Russia against Ukrainian entities. Early on in that conflict, there were an awful lot of outsourced IT providers that operated out of Ukraine. Obviously, a lot of those have shifted their operations out of there now because of the impact. But in the early days of that conflict, there was an awful lot of collateral damage and impact to organizations that were operating in that space. So that would be an example of how it would directly impact an organization that's operating in a country. The sort of fallout from that was organizations that relied on these outsourced IT providers obviously had to look at their supply chain. So they needed to understand what the impact of that geopolitical conflict was. Now, had organizations been monitoring that situation and factored that into their risk posture and their decision making around risk, much in the same way as you would if you were doing an acquisition or you're doing acquisitional growth or moving into a new region within a business, those things would have helped inform some potential future decisions. And for a couple of companies, the decision was really easy: disconnect, move on, find another opportunity, move to plan B. But others were fairly impacted by it. We saw some other examples. I forget now whether it was last spring or a bit further back, but all of the activity in the North Sea and the Baltic regions around ISP cables being severed, there was an awful lot of impact there. There was something that potentially impacts Spain. There was an ISP outage in Spain, not saying that was necessarily linked to nation state activity, but those sorts of things are being influenced by geopolitics. So the relationship between Russia and Europe at that particular point in time was particularly fraught, and it continues to be. But there are a couple of indicators that sort of suggest those things may change over time. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview on that, a bit more detail, Kristen, and answers the question. We've started putting geopolitical updates in our monthly reports now as well. So if you're not getting those, we'll make sure that you're still on that list. But again, we cover off the so what, the now what with those geopolitical updates. Last month, we were talking about the activity around Greenland, for example, and what that meant for some misinformation and disinformation campaigns that were going on there, and also what that would mean for individuals operating in those regions as well. That is us at time already. I come into these sessions thinking, I'm never going to be able to fill this, or I'm going to overrun massively, but somehow managed to keep us straight. Annual Threat Monitor report. You've all been waiting for it. It's a little bit later than we would have liked, but we've got loads of graphics to stick in it, and we want to make sure it's nice and jazzy. We want to get it out in quality. So coming to you on the 5th of March is our annual Threat Monitor report. So watch out for that one. There'll be a load of comms, and we'll make sure that the folks that register for these events will get sight of that nice and early as well. In terms of these events, I'll be back, believe it or not, on the 24th, Tuesday, the 24th of March. So exactly a month from today, it'll be myself again. We'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on the annual threat report. We'll keep on with the usual sort of facts and figures, and hopefully, as I say, I will continue to answer the so what and the now what for you. But for now, we will leave you at that. The PowerPoint has got all of those TTPs for ShinyHunters in the back for you. Give us a shout if you've got any feedback in the meantime. Until next time, we'll catch you soon. Take care.